The bar was louder than usual that night. A group of Marines had taken over 2 tables near the center, raising glasses and celebrating their commander's birthday, and the commander himself was paying for all the drinks. The waitress serving them moved carefully between the tables. Her name was Olivia, blonde, early 30s, calm voice, just another waitress working a small bar 10 kilometers from the Marine base near the border. The Marines joked with her the way drunk Marines sometimes do. "Careful with the drinks, ma'am." One of them laughed. "We need the commander, alive, tomorrow." Everyone laughed, including the commander. Then suddenly, he stopped laughing. The glass slipped from his hand, and he collapsed. For a moment, the entire bar froze. Then Marines rushed to him, but before anyone could react, the quiet waitress dropped beside him, locked her hands together, and started CPR. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Again. Then she looked up at the Marines and shouted a command, and every Marine in the room froze. If you believe people should never be judged by their job, comment where you're watching from and subscribe, because tonight's story begins in a small bar near a Marine base where a quiet waitress was about to save a commander's life. The bar sat about 10 kilometers from the base, close enough that Marines knew the place well, but far enough that it still felt like a break from military life. It wasn't a fancy place. Neon beer signs buzzed softly above the counter, country music played low in the background, and the smell of grilled food and cold drinks hung in the air. But the owner made good cocktails, and the bartender never watered down the whiskey. That alone was enough to make Marines show up every couple of weeks when they wanted a night that didn't feel like the base. On that particular evening, the place was louder than usual. A group of Marines had pushed 2 tables together near the center of the room, raising glasses and laughing louder with each round of drinks. It was the commander's birthday, and he had insisted on paying for everyone's drinks himself. That decision alone had turned a normal night into a celebration. Moving between the tables was the waitress everyone in the bar already knew. Her name was Olivia, blonde hair tied loosely behind her head, light blue waitress dress with a white apron tied neatly around her waist. She looked to be in her early 30s, the kind of calm, friendly person who could keep a busy room under control without raising her voice. Olivia carried trays of drinks between the tables with steady hands, sliding glasses down in front of customers with an easy smile. She had worked at the bar long enough to know most of the regulars by name, especially the Marines who stopped by whenever they were off duty. They liked her because she was quick with service and never seemed bothered by their loud conversations. To them, she was just the dependable waitress who kept the drinks coming. That night, the Marines were especially relaxed. One of them had a birthday hat perched crookedly on his head, clearly placed there by someone else after a few rounds of whiskey. Another Marine leaned back in his chair, telling a story about a training exercise that had gone wrong the previous week. The table erupted in laughter every time he reached the part where someone fell into the mud during a night drill. The commander himself sat near the center of the group, smiling quietly as he watched his Marines enjoy the evening. He wasn't a loud man, but the way the others respected him was obvious. Whenever he lifted his glass for another toast, the entire table followed. Olivia rolled another tray of drinks toward the table and placed fresh glasses in front of the group. One of the younger Marines looked up at her with a grin that made it clear he had already had more than enough to drink. "Ma'am," he said with playful seriousness, "you ever take care of Marines like our medic does?" The table laughed immediately, and Olivia raised an eyebrow in amusement. "Not officially," she replied calmly. Another Marine chimed in before she could roll away. "Well, you might want to start tonight," he joked, pointing toward the commander. "He's been drinking like he's trying to win something." Even the commander laughed at that, shaking his head while lifting his glass again. Olivia smiled politely and continued moving between the tables, collecting empty glasses and dropping off another round of drinks. If the teasing bothered her, she didn't show it. Working around Marines meant hearing jokes like that every night they came through the door. Most of the time, she simply let the laughter pass and kept doing her job. But as she moved past the commander's chair again, something caught her attention for a brief moment. The commander had stopped talking mid-sentence. His hand rested on the edge of the table, fingers gripping the wood slightly tighter than before. At first, it looked like he might just be catching his breath after laughing. Olivia slowed her chair slightly as she passed, watching him out of the corner of her eye. Across the table, one of the Marines was still finishing his story, waving his hands dramatically as he described the moment someone slipped during the exercise. The group roared with laughter again. The commander tried to join in, but instead of laughing, he coughed once, short and sharp. The sound barely stood out in the noise of the bar, but Olivia noticed it immediately. The commander leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand moving toward his chest, as if something didn't feel quite right. Another Marine noticed the movement and nudged him with a grin. "You all right, sir?" he asked jokingly. "Don't tell me the birthday drinks are already winning." The commander attempted to answer, but the words never came out. His glass slipped from his hand and crashed against the floor. For a split second, the room froze, everyone staring at the shattered glass before realizing what had just happened. The commander slumped sideways in his chair and then slid toward the floor. The laughter stopped instantly. Chairs scraped loudly as Marines jumped to their feet, instinctively moving toward him. "Sir!" one of them shouted, dropping to a knee beside him. Another Marine reached for his shoulders, trying to lift him upright. Someone else was already reaching for a phone to call emergency services. In the middle of that chaos, Olivia moved faster than anyone expected. The tray she had been carrying clattered onto the counter as she pushed straight through the cluster of Marines surrounding the commander. "Move," she said firmly. The tone of her voice was so sharp and controlled that several Marines stepped back without even thinking about it. Olivia dropped to her knees beside the commander and checked his neck for a pulse. Her expression changed instantly. The calm smile she had worn all evening disappeared, replaced by the focused concentration of someone who had seen this situation before. "He doesn't have a pulse," she said. The words cut through the bar like a siren. One Marine froze where he stood. Another whispered something under his breath. The bartender behind the counter stopped moving completely. Olivia didn't hesitate. She locked her hands together, positioned them over the commander's chest, and began compressions with steady, practiced rhythm. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Again. The movement was precise, controlled, almost mechanical in its efficiency. The Marines surrounding her watched in stunned silence. This wasn't the frantic CPR people sometimes saw in movies. This looked practiced, professional. Olivia glanced up briefly while continuing the compressions. Her voice changed. It wasn't the voice of a waitress anymore. "You," she said, pointing at one of the Marines near the door. "Call emergency services. Now." The Marine grabbed his phone instantly. She pointed at another. "Clear the table." 2 Marines rushed to push chairs aside. Olivia never stopped the compressions. The rhythm of her hands against the commander's chest echoed through the silent bar, and then she shouted another command, a command that made every Marine in the room look at each other in confusion, because that command was only used by combat medics on the battlefield. The Marines froze for half a second after hearing the command. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way Olivia said them. Calm, direct, exactly the tone used by trained medics in high-pressure situations. Every Marine in that bar had heard commands like that before, usually during field training or real emergencies overseas. Hearing it come from the quiet waitress who had been serving drinks just minutes earlier made the moment feel unreal. But Olivia didn't pause to explain herself. Her hands continued pressing hard and fast against the commander's chest, the rhythm steady and precise. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, again. "Keep the area clear," she said firmly, without even looking up. One Marine immediately stepped back and pushed a chair aside, while another moved the broken glass away from the floor. They weren't thinking about it anymore. They were simply responding to the confidence in her voice. One of the Marines crouched beside her, watching the compressions carefully. "His pulse?" he asked. Olivia shook her head once while continuing the CPR. "Nothing yet." The Marine swallowed hard. He had seen this situation before during deployment, but it was different when the man lying on the floor was their commander, the same man who had been laughing with them just moments earlier. The Marine who had called emergency services was already speaking urgently into his phone near the door. "Cardiac arrest." he said quickly. Yes, sir. We're performing CPR now. The rest of the bar had fallen silent. The bartender stood frozen behind the counter, clutching a towel in one hand. Even the music from the jukebox seemed strangely quiet against the sound of Olivia's compressions echoing across the wooden floor. Olivia leaned closer to the commander's face and checked his breathing again. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Something wasn't right. The compressions were correct, but his chest wasn't responding the way it should. She looked quickly at the Marine kneeling beside her. His airway, she said. It's collapsing. The Marine blinked in confusion. What do you mean? Olivia's gaze swept across the bar for a second, searching for something she could use. I need something hollow, she said sharply. Straw. Tube. Anything. The bartender immediately grabbed a handful of metal cocktail straws from behind the counter and slid them across the bar toward another Marine, who hurried them over. Olivia took one of the straws, inspecting it quickly, before positioning the commander's head. Her movements were fast but careful, the kind of precise motion that came from years of repetition. The Marines watched in stunned silence as she worked. Hold his shoulders steady, she instructed. 2 Marines obeyed instantly. Olivia carefully positioned the straw to maintain the airway, her hands steady even as the situation remained critical. Keep his head tilted back, she said calmly. If his airway closes, the compressions won't matter. The Marine holding the commander's shoulders nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. The word slipped out automatically. Nobody questioned it. The strange part wasn't that they were following her orders. It was that every order she gave sounded exactly like the ones they had heard from combat medics during training in war zones. Olivia resumed compressions immediately after securing the airway. 30 more compressions. 2 breaths. Again. Sweat had begun forming along her forehead, but her pace never slowed. One Marine glanced at another and whispered under his breath, "How does a waitress know how to do that?" The other Marine shook his head slowly, still staring at the scene in front of them. They had seen medics perform life-saving procedures under pressure before, but never inside a bar. Olivia didn't hear the whisper. Or, if she did, she ignored it. Her focus never left the commander's chest. Stay with me, she murmured quietly as she worked. Come on. For several long seconds, nothing changed. The commander remained still on the floor. The Marines around him stood frozen between hope and fear. Then suddenly, Olivia paused. Her hand rested against the commander's neck again, checking for a pulse. For a moment, her face revealed nothing. The Marine beside her leaned closer. Do you feel something? He asked anxiously. Olivia didn't answer immediately. Her fingers pressed gently against the commander's throat. 1 second passed, then another. Finally, she exhaled slowly. There, she said. The word barely carried across the room, but every Marine heard it. Pulse, she added. The tension in the room shifted instantly. One Marine leaned against the nearby table in relief, while another ran a hand across his face, as if trying to wake himself from a dream. The commander's chest rose slightly as air began moving through the airway Olivia had created. It wasn't a full recovery yet, but it was enough to bring hope back into the room. Olivia stayed kneeling beside him, monitoring his breathing carefully. Ambulance should be here soon, she said calmly. The Marine near the door nodded. They're on their way. For the first time since the commander collapsed, the Marines looked directly at Olivia instead of the man on the floor. Now that the immediate crisis had slowed, the question everyone had been thinking finally surfaced. One of the older Marines stepped forward. Ma'am, he said, carefully. Where did you learn to do that? Olivia wiped her hands on a cloth someone had handed her and sat back slightly on her heels. For a moment, it looked like she might brush off the question the same way she had earlier jokes. But the Marine's eyes were fixed on her now, not with teasing or curiosity, but with something closer to respect. She hesitated before answering. Old training, she said quietly. The Marines exchanged glances. They knew that wasn't the full story. The commands she had shouted earlier weren't something someone picked up in a weekend CPR class. Those commands came from combat zones, from medics who had treated wounded soldiers under fire. One Marine leaned forward slightly. "Military training?" he asked. Olivia looked down at the commander again, instead of answering. In the distance, the faint sound of an approaching ambulance siren began to echo down the highway, toward the bar. Before the paramedics arrived, the Marine who had first joked with Olivia earlier spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Ma'am," he said, "who trained you?" Olivia looked up slowly, and for the first time that night the quiet waitress didn't look like a waitress at all. If you've ever seen someone underestimated because of the job they were doing at that moment, type "never judge" in the comments, because the story of how Olivia learned those battlefield skills was about to surprise every Marine standing in that bar. And the answer she was about to give would explain exactly why her hands never shook while a commander's life was slipping away on the floor. The ambulance siren grew louder outside the bar, echoing down the quiet road that led from the Marine base toward the border. Inside the bar, nobody moved. The Marines stood around Olivia and their commander, watching every breath that rose from his chest. The airway she had created with the metal straw was still holding, and his pulse, weak but steady, continued under her fingers. Olivia kept one hand lightly against his neck, while the other rested on the floor to steady herself. Her breathing was controlled, her movements careful, but the Marines could see the concentration in her eyes. This wasn't luck. This was someone who had done this before. The front door burst open, and two paramedics rushed inside carrying equipment bags. They dropped to their knees beside the commander and quickly began attaching monitors. One of them glanced up at Olivia. "Who started CPR?" he asked. Olivia lifted her hand slightly. "I did." The paramedic nodded while checking the monitor screen. "You got his pulse back," he said, almost impressed. The other paramedic carefully removed the straw airway Olivia had improvised and replaced it with proper medical equipment. Within moments, they had stabilized the commander enough to prepare him for transport. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, the Marines instinctively stepped back to clear the path. The room remained silent long after the stretcher rolled out the door. The flashing lights from the ambulance reflected across the bar windows before fading down the road toward the hospital. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The Marines looked at the empty space on the floor, where their commander had been lying just minutes earlier. Then their attention slowly turned back toward Olivia. She was still kneeling where she had performed CPR, wiping her hands quietly with a bar towel, as if trying to return the room to normal. But nothing about the moment felt normal anymore. One of the older Marines stepped forward. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had spent many years in uniform. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that wasn't basic first aid." Olivia didn't respond right away. She placed the towel on the counter and pushed herself up slowly, leaning against the bar for a moment. The adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency was beginning to fade now, leaving behind the familiar weight she always felt when memories came back. She looked around the bar at the Marines who had been joking with her earlier that evening. Their expressions had changed completely. The teasing smiles were gone. Now they were watching her with quiet curiosity and respect. "You asked where I learned that," Olivia said finally. The Marines waited. Her voice stayed calm, but there was something deeper in it now. "I used to work with Marine units overseas," she continued. One of the younger Marines blinked in surprise. "You were a medic?" he asked. Olivia nodded slightly. "Combat medic," she said. The words hung in the air for a moment. The Marines exchanged quick glances. Combat medics weren't just trained in first aid. They were the ones who ran toward the wounded when everyone else ran for cover. They kept soldiers alive long enough to reach a helicopter or field hospital. The older Marine folded his arms slowly. "Where did you serve?" he asked. Olivia looked down at the floor for a moment before answering. "Afghanistan." The bar felt even quieter than before. She leaned lightly against the counter as she spoke again, her eyes unfocused as if she were looking at something far beyond the room. "My job was to keep Marines alive long enough to get them home," she said. No one interrupted. I treated dozens of wounded soldiers during those deployments. One Marine shifted his weight slightly. "And then you left?" he asked. Olivia nodded once. "There was a mission," she said quietly. The Marines listened closely now. A night patrol outside a small village. Her voice slowed as the memory surfaced. "We walked into an ambush." The Marines knew that kind of story. They had heard it before from veterans who had seen the worst nights of war. "Several Marines were hit in the first minute," Olivia continued. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the counter. "I tried to save them." No one spoke. "But sometimes," she said softly, "you can't save everyone." One of the younger Marines lowered his eyes. The room carried the heavy silence that only soldiers truly understood. Olivia straightened slightly, forcing herself back into the present moment. "After that mission, I couldn't keep doing it," she said. "Too many faces stayed in my head." The older Marine nodded slowly. He didn't need any more explanation. Combat medics carried a different kind of burden than most soldiers. Another Marine finally asked the question everyone had been thinking. "So you left the service?" Olivia gave a small shrug. "Yes." The Marine looked around the bar again. "And now you're here." Olivia smiled faintly. "Life changes." One of the Marines leaned against the table where they had been celebrating earlier. "You saved the commander tonight," he said quietly. Olivia shook her head slightly. "The ambulance team will finish the job." The Marine met her eyes. "You kept him alive long enough for them to get there." For a moment, Olivia didn't respond. Then she nodded once. A phone buzzed on the table. One of the Marines picked it up and glanced at the screen. "It's the hospital," he said. Everyone in the bar turned toward him. He listened for a moment before lowering the phone slowly. "They say the commander's stable." A breath of relief moved through the room. The Marines looked back toward Olivia. And in that moment, every one of them realized something. The woman they had been teasing earlier that evening was the same kind of medic who had fought to keep Marines alive on a battlefield thousands of miles away, and somewhere in the hospital across town, their commander had just learned that his life now depended on a waitress who once carried Marines out of war. But when he woke up, the first question he asked the doctors would surprise everyone in that bar. Because the commander didn't want to know what happened. He wanted to know who saved him. The bar felt strangely quiet after the ambulance disappeared down the road. Only a few minutes earlier, the place had been full of laughter, birthday toasts, and the loud voices of Marines enjoying a rare night away from base. Now the music from the jukebox had stopped. The glasses on the tables sat untouched, and the Marines stood in small groups, speaking in low voices. Olivia moved slowly behind the counter, collecting the glasses that had been left behind during the emergency. She worked calmly, like she always did, but everyone in the room was watching her differently now. The same woman who had been quietly serving drinks an hour earlier had just saved their commander's life. One of the Marines approached the counter, resting his hands on the wood surface. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. "They just called again." Olivia looked up from the tray she was wiping. The Marine held up his phone. "The commander made it through surgery. Doctors say he's stable." A few Marines nearby let out quiet sighs of relief. The tension that had been sitting in the room finally loosened. Olivia nodded slowly, a faint smile appearing on her face. "That's good," she said softly. She didn't say anything else. But the Marines could see the relief in her eyes. Saving someone's life didn't always end the moment CPR stopped. Sometimes the waiting afterward was the hardest part. 2 weeks passed before Olivia heard anything else about the commander. Life at the bar returned to its normal rhythm. Truck drivers came through late at night. Locals stopped in for burgers and cold beer. Every now and then a few Marines visited again, but the mood was different now. They greeted Olivia with quiet respect rather than teasing jokes. Some of them still looked at her like they were trying to understand the story she had told that night. Olivia never brought it up again. To her, it was simply another life saved, something she had spent years doing before she ever worked in that bar. One afternoon, just as Olivia finished wiping down the counter before the evening crowd arrived, the door opened and two Marines stepped inside. Their uniforms were crisp, their posture straight. One of them approached the counter with a polite nod. "Olivia?" he asked. She recognized the name, Patch, on his chest, immediately. He was from the same unit as the commander. "Yes," she replied. The Marine placed a small envelope on the counter. "The commander asked us to give this to you." Olivia hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for saving my life." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Beneath the message was another line. "Would you consider visiting the base next week?" Olivia folded the note slowly. "Why?" she asked. The Marines exchanged a brief glance before answering. "The commander wants you to speak to the new recruits," one of them said. "He says they should hear from someone who knows what it means to keep Marines alive." Olivia didn't respond immediately. The idea of walking back onto a military base brought memories she had spent years trying to quiet. Afghanistan, dust-filled roads, helicopters lifting off under fire, faces of Marines she had treated and the ones she couldn't save. For a moment, she stared at the envelope in her hands. Then she looked up again. "I'll think about it," she said. A week later, Olivia found herself standing near the edge of a Marine training field. The sun hung high above the base, and rows of young Marines sat on the grass listening as instructors demonstrated basic battlefield medical techniques. Olivia felt the familiar tension in her chest as she watched them. The commander approached from behind, walking carefully but steadily. The doctors had warned him to take things slowly after the cardiac arrest, but he insisted on being there. "Glad you came," he said. Olivia nodded politely. "You're looking better." "Thanks to you." The commander looked out at the recruits sitting on the field. "These young Marines will be deployed someday," he said. "Some of them will face situations where seconds decide whether someone lives or dies." He glanced back at Olivia. "I want them to learn from someone who understands that." For the next hour, Olivia stood beside the training group, explaining the same techniques she had used in the bar that night. She demonstrated how to recognize cardiac arrest, how to perform CPR correctly, how to keep an airway open when someone stopped breathing. The recruits listened carefully. They could tell she wasn't reading from a training manual. Every movement she showed them came from real experience. When the session ended, the commander approached her again. "You could teach here," he said quietly. "We need instructors like you." Olivia smiled slightly, but there was sadness in it. "I appreciate that," she replied, "but I've already done my time." The commander studied her expression before nodding slowly. "Fair enough," he said. "But you'll always be welcome here." That evening, Olivia returned to the same bar 10 kilometers from the base. The lights glowed warmly through the windows, and the familiar sounds of conversation and laughter drifted out into the parking lot. Inside, a few Marines were already seated at a table near the corner. When they saw her walk behind the counter, they lifted their glasses in greeting. Not the playful teasing from before, but something quieter. Respect. Olivia tied her apron around her waist and picked up a tray of drinks. To anyone walking into the bar, she looked exactly the same as she always had, a calm blonde waitress working another evening shift. But the Marines in that room knew the truth. The woman serving them drinks had once fought to keep Marines alive in a war zone. And sometimes the bravest people aren't the ones still wearing the uniform. They're the ones who carried the memories home and kept helping others anyway. If stories like Olivia's remind you that courage doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off, consider subscribing and staying with us for more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us every day.